Good evening all, and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight we journey to Canada's frozen north, where the Yukon territory holds secrets darker than its endless winter nights. 10 true accounts from one of Earth's most isolated frontiers, where vast wilderness swallows the unprepared, and the line between reality and nightmare dissolves in sub-zero silence. These are not campfire tales passed down through generations. These are documented encounters with forces that defy explanation, experienced by ordinary people who ventured too far into places where humans were never meant to tread. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of the Yukon wilderness, where civilization ends and terror begins. I was 23 years old when I took the job at the Whitehorse Mining Heritage Museum. It seemed perfect at the time. I had just finished my history degree, and working as a tour guide at one of Yukon's most significant historical sites felt like exactly where I was supposed to be. The museum sat on the grounds of the old Pueblo copper mine, a place that had operated from 1917 until the catastrophic collapse that killed 9 men and shut the operation down permanently. The main exhibit building was modern enough, but the original mine entrance remained sealed behind a heavy iron gate, preserved as a memorial to those who had died nearly a century ago. My supervisor, Margaret, was a woman in her 60s who had lived in Whitehorse her entire life. During my first week of training, she walked me through the exhibits, explaining the copper boom that had drawn prospectors to the area, the dangerous conditions the miners had endured, and the tragedy that had ended it all. We stood before a large photograph of the 9 men who had perished. Their faces stared back at us, solemn and weathered, unaware that the picture had been taken just 3 days before the collapse that would trap them 300 feet below the surface. They never recovered the bodies, Margaret told me, her voice quiet in the empty museum. The structural damage was too severe. The mine filled with water and toxic gases. It would have been a death sentence to send rescue teams down there, so they sealed it and declared it a tomb. She paused, looking at the photograph. Some people say you can still hear them down there, tapping on the pipes, trying to signal for help that never came. I had laughed it off as local legend, the kind of ghost story that gets attached to any place where people died tragically. Margaret had given me a strange look, something between pity and warning, but she had not pressed the issue. I had assumed she was just trying to add some theatrical flair to the tour narratives. The museum operated year-round, but winter hours were limited. From November through March, we closed at 5 in the evening, and most days I was the only staff member on duty. The isolation did not bother me. I'd grown up in rural Ontario, and the quiet solitude of the Yukon winter felt familiar and peaceful. I would give my last tour at 3:30, lock up the exhibits, complete my closing checklist, and head home by 6 at the latest. It was mid-January when things began to change. I was doing my final walkthrough of the building, checking that all the display cases were secured and the interactive exhibits were powered down. The museum had excellent heating, but I noticed that the back hallway leading toward the memorial room felt considerably colder than the rest of the building. I made a note to mention it to Margaret, thinking there might be a draft from a poorly sealed window. The memorial room was a small, solemn space at the rear of the museum. It contained the photograph of the 9 miners, their names engraved on a bronze plaque, and a small altar where visitors could leave flowers or tokens of remembrance. Behind the memorial, through a reinforced glass window, you could see the sealed mine entrance. Heavy iron bars and a concrete plug prevented any access, but the original wooden support beams were still visible, rotting and dark with age. I was checking the climate control sensors in the memorial room when I heard it for the first time. A distant metallic tapping sound, slow and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, listening. The sound seemed to be coming from behind the glass, from the direction of the sealed mine entrance. I told myself it was the building settling, or perhaps the old heating pipes expanding and contracting in the cold. But the rhythm was too regular, too purposeful. I pressed my ear against the glass window, my breath fogging the surface. The tapping continued. 9 distinct knocks, then a pause, then 9 knocks again. The pattern repeated 3 times before falling silent. I stood there for a full 5 minutes, waiting for it to resume, but heard nothing more. The rational part of my brain cycled through explanations. Water dripping, structural settling, maybe even animals that had somehow gotten into the sealed sections of the mine. None of those explanations felt adequate, but I forced myself to accept them because the alternative was too unsettling to consider. I finished my closing duties and left quickly that night, but I could not stop thinking about the tapping. 9 knocks, 9 dead miners. It was too specific to be coincidence, but I refused to let myself believe what that might mean. The tapping happened again 3 nights later. Same time, same pattern. 9 knocks, pause, 9 knocks, pause, 9 knocks, then silence. This time I was ready. I had brought my phone and recorded the sound. When I played it back later at home, the tapping was clearly audible, metallic, hollow, and disturbingly rhythmic. I researched mining disasters and learned that trapped miners would often tap on pipes or rock walls to signal their location to rescue teams. 9 taps could mean 9 men, 9 lives waiting for salvation that would never arrive. I showed the recording to Margaret the next day. She listened without expression, then looked at me with those same pitying eyes she had given me during my first week. "You hear them now," she said simply. It was not a question. "You have heard this before?" I asked. She nodded. Every staff member who works closing shift alone eventually hears it. Some people hear it once and never again. Others hear it regularly. We have had the building inspected multiple times. Engineers, structural specialists, even paranormal investigators. No one can find a source for the sound. The mine has been sealed for over 100 years. There's nothing down there that could make that noise, but we hear it anyway. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Why did you not warn me?" "Would you have believed me?" she asked. "Or would you have thought I was a superstitious old woman trying to scare the new employee?" She had a point. I would not have taken it seriously until I experienced it myself. The tapping became a regular occurrence, not every night, but several times a week. I began to dread my closing shifts, particularly the moment when I had to walk through the memorial room for my final check. The temperature in that hallway had dropped noticeably. I started wearing my winter coat, even inside the building, when I worked late. Then, about a month after I first heard the tapping, something changed. I was in the memorial room, standing before the photograph of the 9 miners, when I felt it. A presence. The kind of sensation that makes your skin crawl and your heart rate spike, even though you cannot identify why. The air pressure in the room seemed to shift, becoming heavy and oppressive. My breath came out in visible puffs of vapor despite the functioning heaters. And then I saw them. Shadow figures, indistinct and dark, like shapes cut from black paper and layered against the wall near the memorial plaque. There were 9 of them. They did not move, but I could feel their attention on me. The weight of their gaze was overwhelming, accusatory, desperate. I could not move, could not breathe, could not look away. The tapping started again, but this time it was louder, more insistent. The 9 knocks repeated over and over, echoing through the room. The shadow figures remained motionless, but I had the distinct impression they were trying to communicate something. That they had been trying to communicate for 100 years, and no one had understood. I do not know how long I stood there. Seconds. Minutes. Time felt distorted and strange, but eventually I found my voice. "I hear you," I whispered. "I know you are there." The tapping stopped immediately. The shadow figures flickered like a flame in the wind, and then they were gone. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and I could breathe again. The room was still cold, but the presence had vanished. I left the museum that night and called in sick for the next 3 days. I could not bring myself to return. When I finally did go back, Margaret took one look at my face and knew what had happened. "You saw them," she said. I nodded. "I'm sorry," she said. "I hoped you would be one of the ones who only heard the tapping. Seeing them is worse." I wanted to quit. I'd already started looking at other job postings, but something kept me from actually submitting my resignation. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was a strange sense of obligation. Those men had died terribly, trapped in darkness, and their story deserved to be told. If working at the museum meant occasionally experiencing the remnants of their trauma, perhaps that was a burden I could bear. But I drew a line. I told Margaret I would no longer work closing shifts alone. If I was scheduled to close, someone else needed to be there with me, even if they were just doing paperwork in the front office. She agreed without argument. She had probably been expecting that request. The experiences did not stop entirely, but they became less frequent and less intense. I still heard the tapping occasionally, especially during the winter months when the days were shortest and darkness came early. I never saw the shadow figures again, though I sometimes felt that same heavy presence in the memorial room. I researched the collapse extensively, reading every historical document and newspaper article I could find. The 9 miners had been working a new shaft when the support structure failed. They had survived the initial collapse and had managed to signal for help by tapping on the water pipes. Rescue teams had tried for 3 days to reach them, but secondary collapses and flooding made it impossible. The tapping had stopped on the 4th day. The men had either drowned or suffocated. Their final hours must have been filled with terror and desperate hope, waiting for a rescue that came too late. I still work at the museum. It has been 2 years since I first heard the tapping, and I have made peace with the knowledge that the building is haunted. I tell visitors about the 9 miners who died. I make sure their names are spoken aloud and their story is not forgotten. And when I hear that slow, deliberate tapping echoing from the sealed mine entrance, I stop what I'm doing and listen. I acknowledge their presence, because that is what they want, to be remembered, to not be lost in the darkness forever. But I will never work a closing shift alone again, and I still have nightmares about those shadow figures standing silent and still near the memorial plaque, trapped between worlds, unable to find peace. Some nights I wake up hearing the tapping in my dreams. 9 knocks, pause, 9 knocks, pause. The rhythm of desperate men who died waiting for help that never came. And I wonder if they will ever stop trying to signal, or if they will tap forever in the darkness, 300 feet below the frozen Yukon ground, waiting for someone to finally understand. I was 19 years old when I drove the Alaska Highway alone in the dead of winter. Looking back, I realize how reckless that decision was, but at the time it felt necessary. I had landed a job at a mining camp outside Dawson City, and I needed to get there before my start date. The drive from Whitehorse to Dawson is roughly 530 kilometers, and in January, with only about 5 hours of daylight, most of that journey happens in complete darkness. My parents had tried to talk me out of going alone, but I was stubborn and confident. I had grown up driving in Canadian winters. I had a reliable vehicle, emergency supplies, and a fully charged phone. What could possibly go wrong? I left Whitehorse just after 2 in the afternoon, hoping to arrive in Dawson before midnight. The first hour of the drive was uneventful. The highway was clear, and my truck handled the icy patches without issue. I had my music playing, a thermos of coffee in the cup holder, and the heater running at full blast. The landscape was stunning in that stark, frozen way that only the Yukon can be. Endless snow-covered forests, mountains in the distance, and a sky that was already beginning to darken despite the early hour. By 4 o'clock, full darkness had settled over the highway. This was not the darkness of a city or even a small town. This was absolute primal darkness, the kind where your headlights feel like the only light in the entire world. No streetlights, no houses, no other vehicles. Just me, my truck, and hundreds of kilometers of empty road stretching out ahead. I had been driving for about 3 hours when I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Fatigue, maybe. Or the hypnotic effect of staring at snow-covered pavement for too long. But as my headlights swept across the right side of the road, I saw it clearly. A figure, standing perfectly still about 30 feet from the edge of the highway. My foot instinctively moved to the brake, slowing the truck as I tried to process what I was seeing. The figure was impossibly tall, at least 8 feet, maybe taller. It was pitch black, so dark that it seemed to absorb the light from my headlights rather than reflect it. And it was perfectly two-dimensional, like a shadow cast against nothing. No depth, no features, just a tall black silhouette standing motionless in the snow. My rational brain tried to supply explanations. A tree, a road sign, some trick of perspective and shadow. But I knew what I was seeing, and it was none of those things. This was a figure, humanoid in shape but wrong in every other way. Too tall, too flat, too still. I should have kept driving. Every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to press the accelerator and get as far away from that thing as possible. But I was frozen, my truck crawling forward at maybe 10 kilometers per hour, my eyes locked on the figure. As I drew closer, I could see that it was oriented toward the road toward me, though it had no face or features that would indicate where it was looking. Then it moved. I will never forget the way it moved. It did not walk or run in any conventional sense. It simply shifted position with impossible speed, crossing the 50 feet from the roadside to the middle of the highway in less than a second. One moment, it was standing in the snow. The next, it was directly in front of my truck, so close that I slammed on the brakes and felt the vehicle slide on the ice. I screamed. I know I screamed because my throat was raw afterward, but I do not remember the sound coming out. The figure stood there in the beam of my headlights, still perfectly two-dimensional, still impossibly tall. And then it moved again, this time crossing to the left side of the road in another burst of unnatural speed. It did not move around my truck. It did not leap or run. It simply was in one place and then was in another, as if the space between did not exist. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely control the steering wheel. I pressed the accelerator, desperate to get away, but something was wrong with the truck. The headlights flickered, dimming and brightening erratically. The radio, which had been playing classic rock, dissolved into static and then began cycling through stations on its own. Fragments of voices and music overlapping in a chaotic jumble. The digital clock on the dashboard went blank, then displayed random numbers that made no sense. I was crying now, fumbling with my phone to call for help, but the screen would not turn on. The battery had been at 70% when I last checked. Now it was completely dead. I threw it into the passenger seat and focused on driving, pushing the accelerator as hard as I dared on the icy highway. The figure was no longer visible in my headlights, but I could feel it. I could feel it watching me, following me, keeping pace with my vehicle even though I was now going 80 kilometers per hour. The radio static grew louder, and beneath it, I began to hear something else. A low rhythmic sound, almost like breathing, deep and slow and coming from everywhere at once. The temperature inside the truck dropped rapidly. I could see my breath fogging in front of my face despite the heater running at maximum. Frost began to form on the inside of the windshield, spreading in strange geometric patterns that seemed deliberate, intentional. I do not know how long I drove like that. Time felt distorted, elastic. It could have been 10 minutes or an hour. My entire world narrowed to the small cone of light from my headlights and the desperate need to keep moving. I passed landmarks I recognized, small pull-offs and kilometer markers I had noted on the drive up, but something was wrong. I passed the same landmarks multiple times as if I were driving in circles, even though the highway was a straight line. Then, without warning, everything snapped back to normal. The radio stopped its chaotic cycling and returned to the rock station I had been listening to. The headlights stabilized. The temperature inside the truck rose as the heater kicked back into full function. And my phone, when I grabbed it from the passenger seat, showed a full charge and the correct time. Except the time was not correct. When the strange experience had started, it had been just after 7 in the evening. Now, according to my phone and the truck's clock, it was 10:45. Nearly 4 hours had passed, but I'd only driven about 90 kilometers. The math did not make sense. Even accounting for the time I had slowed down and the strange loop I seemed to have driven, I should have covered much more distance. Where had those hours gone? I pulled over at the first safe spot I could find, a small rest area with a single picnic table buried in snow. My hands were still shaking, and I needed to collect myself before continuing. I stepped out of the truck, and that was when I saw them. Deep scratches in the paint on the roof of my vehicle, long parallel gouges that ran from the front windshield to the back window. They had not been there when I left Whitehorse. I'd washed and inspected the truck that morning. These were fresh, exposing bare metal beneath the dark blue paint. I ran my fingers over the scratches, my breath catching in my throat. They were too deep and too regular to be from branches, too high to be from anything at ground level. Something had clawed the roof of my truck while I was driving, something tall enough to reach the top of a full-size vehicle. I got back in the truck and drove the remaining distance to Dawson City without stopping. I kept the radio on for company, checking my mirrors obsessively, flinching at every shadow. When I finally pulled into the parking lot of the worker housing complex where I would be staying, it was just after midnight. The first thing I did was examine the scratches again under the security lights. They were even worse than I had thought. 4 parallel gouges, each about 2 feet long, carved deep into the metal. The next day, I asked around about what I had seen. Most people dismissed it as fatigue or the strange effects of driving in extreme darkness. But one of the older workers, a man named Tom who had lived in the Yukon for 40 years, pulled me aside after hearing my story. He told me that I was not the first person to report seeing something like that on the Alaska highway. He called it the Shadow Walker, a figure that appeared to lone travelers on remote stretches of road, always at night, always in winter. Some people saw it and nothing happened. Others experienced missing time, vehicle malfunctions, and unexplained marks on their cars. The First Nations people up here have stories about it, Tom said. Goes back generations. They say it is not something from this world, not a ghost, not an animal, something else, something that exists in the spaces between. And if it takes an interest in you, you lose time because it pulls you partway into its world. I asked him what people were supposed to do if they encountered it. He shrugged. Most people who see it once never see it again. It is like it marks you somehow, and then it moves on. But some people see it multiple times. Those are the ones you have to worry about, the ones it does not want to let go. I installed a dash cam in my truck the next day, front and rear cameras, running constantly whenever the vehicle was in operation. I told myself it was for insurance purposes, but I knew the real reason. I needed evidence. I needed to know that what I had experienced was real and not some hallucination brought on by isolation and darkness. I have driven that stretch of highway dozens of times since that night. I have never seen the Shadow Walker again, but I have watched the dash cam footage from every trip, scrutinizing the edges of the frame, looking for any sign of that impossible figure. So far, nothing. The recordings show exactly what you would expect. Empty highway, snow, darkness, nothing unusual, but I keep the footage anyway, and I have joined an online group of people who have had similar experiences in remote areas of the Yukon and Alaska. There are more of us than you would think. People who have seen things they cannot explain, experienced missing time, found unexplained damage to their vehicles. We share our stories and try to make sense of what happened to us. Some people think it is paranormal. Others lean toward extraterrestrial explanations. A few believe it is something even stranger, something that defies categorization entirely. I still live in Dawson City. I still drive the Alaska Highway regularly, but I never drive it alone at night anymore. I always travel during daylight hours, or if I must drive after dark, I find someone to carpool with. The scratches on my truck roof are still there. I have never had them repaired. They serve as a reminder that what I experienced was real, even if I cannot explain it. Sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed, I think about those missing hours. Where did I go? What happened during that time that I cannot remember? The rational part of my brain wants to believe it was just a blackout, a gap in memory caused by stress or fear, but I know that is not the truth. Something happened during those hours. Something was done to me, or shown to me, or taken from me. And whatever it was, I am glad I cannot remember it. Because if the Shadow Walker exists, if there really are things that can pull you between worlds and steal your time and mark your vehicle with scratches that should not be possible, then what else is out there? What other impossible things exist in the darkness beyond our headlights? And what do they want with us? I do not have answers to those questions. I am not sure I want answers. All I know is that the Yukon wilderness is vast and old and filled with things we do not understand. And on certain winter nights when the darkness is absolute and the cold is deep enough to crack stone, those things come close to our world, close enough to be seen, close enough to touch, close enough to take pieces of us that we will never get back. I was 25 when I decided to do a solo backcountry camping trip in Nahanni National Park. I had been working in Fort Simpson for 6 months, and the isolation of office work was driving me crazy. I needed to get out into the wilderness, to feel small under the vast northern sky, to remind myself why I had moved to the territories in the first place. Nahanni seemed like the perfect destination. Remote, beautiful, and challenging enough to satisfy my need for adventure. What I did not fully appreciate at the time was Nahanni's reputation. The park is home to Headless Creek, named for the decapitated bodies of 2 prospectors found there in 1908. The entire valley has a dark history. Indigenous groups avoided certain areas for generations, calling it a cursed place. Over the decades, at least 44 people have died or vanished in the park under mysterious circumstances. But I was young and confident, and I dismissed the stories as exaggeration and coincidence. Bad things happen in remote wilderness. That does not make a place cursed. I obtained my backcountry permit, filed my travel plan with Park Services, and set out in mid-August when the weather was most favorable. My plan was to spend 7 days hiking and camping in the valley, staying well away from the technical climbing areas and waterfalls that had claimed lives in the past. I had all the proper gear, bear spray, a satellite communicator for emergencies, and enough food for 10 days in case weather delayed my exit. The first 2 days were perfect. The landscape was breathtaking in a way that photographs can never capture. Massive limestone cliffs, pristine rivers, forests that seemed untouched by human presence. I saw a grizzly from a safe distance, watched Dall sheep navigate impossible rock faces, and fell asleep each night to the sound of wind through the trees. I felt alive in a way that city life could never provide. On the 3rd morning, I noticed something strange. Boot prints in the soft earth around my tent. They formed a complete circle, about 15 feet in diameter, with my tent at the center. The prints were fresh, made sometime during the night while I had been sleeping. I examined them carefully, my heart rate increasing. They were definitely human prints, large, probably a men's size, 11 or 12. And they were not mine. My boots had a different tread pattern, and besides, Why would I walk in a circle around my own tent in the middle of the night? I looked around the campsite, suddenly aware of how alone I was. The nearest other permitted camper, according to the park registry, was at least 30 kilometers away. There should not be anyone else in this area. I checked my gear. Nothing was missing. Nothing had been moved. But someone had been here, walking around my tent while I slept, and that realization made my skin crawl. I told myself it could be a park ranger doing a safety check, though that seemed unlikely given the hour and the odd circling pattern. I decided to continue with my trip but remained more vigilant. That night, I kept my knife and bear spray inside the tent within easy reach. I slept poorly, waking at every sound, but nothing happened. When I emerged in the morning, there were no new prints. I felt foolish for being so paranoid. On the fourth day, I noticed my food cache had been disturbed. I had hung it properly, using the bear safe method, suspended from a tree branch 12 feet off the ground. But when I went to retrieve it for breakfast, I saw that the rope had been partially untied, not torn or chewed, as would happen with a bear or other animal. Untied. Someone with hands and opposable thumbs had tried to access my food. They had not succeeded in getting the bag down, but they had tried. Now I was genuinely frightened. This was not random. Someone was watching me, following me, interacting with my campsite while I was asleep or away. I pulled out my satellite communicator and considered calling for extraction. But what would I say? Someone walked around my tent and touched my food rope. It sounded paranoid, and I had no proof of malicious intent. Park services would think I was panicking over nothing. I decided to continue, but to break camp early and put some serious distance between myself and whoever was out there. I hiked hard that day, covering nearly 20 kilometers over difficult terrain. By evening, I was exhausted but felt better. I had seen no signs of other people, no prints, no disturbed vegetation, nothing. I set up camp in a small clearing with good sight lines in all directions, positioned so I could see anyone approaching from a distance. That night, I heard it. A whistling sound, clear and melodic, coming from the tree line about 100 meters from my tent. It was a simple tune, just a few notes repeated over and over. A child's song, almost, but distorted somehow. Too slow, too deliberate. I sat upright in my sleeping bag, listening. The whistling continued for perhaps 5 minutes, then stopped abruptly. I did not sleep at all that night. I sat with my back against my backpack, knife in hand, watching the tree line. The whistling did not resume, but I felt watched. I felt exposed despite being inside my tent. When dawn finally came, I packed up immediately and started hiking toward the park boundary. I was done. Whatever was happening, I wanted no part of it. But as I hiked, I saw him. A figure standing on a ridge across the valley, maybe 300 meters away. He was too far for me to make out details, but I could see he was holding something to his face. Binoculars. He was watching me through binoculars. I stopped walking and stared back. For a long moment, we remained motionless. Then he lowered the binoculars and raised one hand in what might have been a wave. I did not wave back. I turned and continued hiking, moving as fast as the terrain would allow. My mind was racing. Was this person dangerous? Were they just another camper who happened to be in the area? But if so, why the circling of my tent? Why the middle of the night whistling? Why watch me from a distance through binoculars instead of approaching and introducing themselves like a normal person would? I checked my map and GPS. The quickest route out of the park would take another 2 days of hiking. I had no choice but to keep moving and hope this person lost interest. I pushed myself hard, barely stopping to rest, chewing on energy bars as I walked. By nightfall, I had covered an impressive distance. I set up camp in a defensible position, my back to a large boulder, with a clear view of the surrounding area. I did not light a fire. I did not want to broadcast my location. I ate a cold meal and sat in the growing darkness, listening. For hours, nothing, just the normal sounds of the wilderness. I was beginning to think I had left my stalker behind. Then, just after midnight, the whistling started again. The same simple tune. But this time, it was closer. Much closer. Maybe 50 meters away, hidden in the trees. I grabbed my bear spray and my knife and stood up. My hands were shaking. "Who is there?" I called out. "Show yourself." The whistling stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then a voice called back. "Just a fellow traveler, friend. No need for alarm." The voice was male, middle-aged maybe, with a strange accent I could not place. There was something off about the tone, too friendly, too casual for the circumstances. "Stay away from my camp," I shouted. "I have reported your presence to Park Services." This was a lie. I had not used my satellite communicator except to confirm my position, but I wanted him to think authorities knew about him. There was a long pause. Then the voice came again, closer now. "That is not very neighborly. I have been watching you. You seem like a capable young man, strong, good at navigating. I could use someone like you." "Use me for what?" I called back, scanning the tree line but seeing nothing in the darkness. No answer, just silence. I stood there for what felt like hours, weapon ready, eyes straining to penetrate the shadows. Eventually, I heard movement, branches breaking, footsteps receding. He was leaving. I did not relax. I spent the rest of the night sitting upright, dozing occasionally, but never truly sleeping. At first light, I broke camp and started hiking again. I was exhausted, running on adrenaline and fear. My satellite communicator had a distress beacon, but I hesitated to use it. A distress call would bring a helicopter, but it would also mean explaining everything that had happened. And I still had no concrete evidence of danger, just boot prints and whistling and a creepy conversation in the dark. That decision almost cost me my life. I was hiking through a narrow section of trail, steep slopes on both sides, when I saw it. A large hunting knife, buried blade first in a tree trunk at eye level. It had not been there when I passed through this area days earlier. I would have noticed. And attached to the knife handle was a piece of paper held in place by the blade. My hands were shaking as I pulled the knife free and unfolded the paper. The message was written in crude block letters. "Leave now or join the others." Others. Plural. I thought about the 44 deaths and disappearances in Nahanni's history. Thought about the prospectors found decapitated. Thought about all the people who had vanished without a trace in this valley. And I ran. I do not remember much of the next several hours. I ran when the terrain allowed it. Hiked as fast as I could when it did not. I abandoned my camping gear, keeping only my backpack with food, water, and my emergency beacon. At some point, I activated the beacon. I did not care anymore about looking paranoid. I wanted out. The helicopter found me 6 hours later. I was still hiking, delirious with exhaustion and fear. The park ranger who extracted me took one look at my face and knew something serious had happened. I told him everything, showed him the knife and the note. He radioed for additional rangers to search the area. They found evidence. An illegal camp hidden deep in the backcountry, far from designated camping areas. Signs of long-term habitation, food caches, tools, and disturbingly, personal items that did not belong to the camp's occupant. A woman's necklace, a water bottle with someone else's name on it, a torn backpack. They never found the man who had stalked me. He vanished into the wilderness before they could locate him. The Park Service investigation revealed that several missing persons cases in Nahanni might be connected. People who had gone into the park and never came out. The official conclusion was that a transient had been living illegally in the backcountry, possibly for years, and may have been responsible for at least some of the disappearances. But they could not prove anything. No bodies were found. No definitive evidence of violence. I moved away from the territories 3 months later. I could not stay. Every time I looked at the mountains, I thought about that voice in the darkness, that whistling, that message carved into the tree. I thought about what would have happened if I had not left when I did, if I had stayed one more night, if I had not activated that beacon. I still have nightmares about Nahanni, about being watched from the tree line. about waking up to find boot prints circling my tent, about voices calling out of the darkness, too friendly, too wrong. And I wonder about the others, the ones who did not make it out, the ones who joined whatever collection that man had hidden somewhere in that cursed valley. I wonder if they heard the whistling too, in those final moments, if they saw the knife buried in the tree, if they ran, like I did, but not quite fast enough. I was 22 years old when I had my encounter on the Klondike Highway. I had been living in Skagway, Alaska for the summer, working at a tourist shop during the cruise ship season. It was late September, and the tourists had mostly stopped coming. My lease was ending, and I had decided to head to Whitehorse to visit a friend before flying home to Ontario. The drive from Skagway to Whitehorse is only about 3 hours, and I had made it several times that summer without incident. I left Skagway around 4 in the afternoon. The weather was clear, and I was looking forward to a few days of relaxation before the long journey home. The highway was mostly empty, which was normal for that time of year. The summer rush was over, and winter had not yet brought the ice road truckers and hardy locals who braved the worst conditions. About 45 minutes into the drive, I saw her. A young woman standing on the shoulder of the highway, thumb out in the universal gesture of hitchhiking. I had passed hitchhikers before and never stopped. My parents had drilled into me the dangers of picking up strangers, especially on remote roads. But something about this woman made me slow down. She looked so out of place, so vulnerable. She was wearing what I can only describe as vintage clothing, a long wool coat, the kind you might see in photographs from the 1940s, with a collar that came up high around her neck. Her hair was styled in victory rolls, and she wore dark lipstick. At first, I thought she might be coming from some kind of historical reenactment event. We had those occasionally in the area, gold rush celebrations and period costume parties. But we were in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town. What kind of event would be out here? I pulled over before I fully processed the decision. She approached the passenger window, and I rolled it down. Up close, I could see that she was probably in her 20s, pale-skinned with delicate features. She did not smile when she looked at me, just stood there, waiting. "Do you need a ride?" I asked, suddenly feeling foolish. Of course she needed a ride. That was why she was hitchhiking. She nodded slowly and opened the door. The moment she got into the car, the temperature dropped. I mean, literally dropped, as if someone had cranked the air conditioning to maximum, except I did not have the air conditioning on. My breath became visible in little puffs of fog. I reached for the heater controls, thinking something had malfunctioned. But the woman spoke before I could adjust anything. "Thank you for stopping." Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper with an accent I could not quite place. No one stops anymore. "Where are you headed?" I asked, pulling back onto the highway. I kept glancing at her from the corner of my eye. She sat perfectly straight, hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead through the windshield. She did not blink. I know that sounds like a strange thing to notice, but it was the kind of detail that your brain fixates on when something feels wrong. "Up the road," she said. "I will tell you where to turn." We drove in silence for several minutes. I tried to make conversation, asking where she was from, what had brought her to this area, but she did not respond, just sat there, motionless, cold. I became acutely aware of how cold she was, not just the temperature in the car, but her physical presence. It was like sitting next to an open freezer. Then she spoke again. "Turn left, at the next road." I looked ahead and saw a small dirt road branching off from the highway. It was unmarked, barely visible, the kind of forgotten access road that probably led to an abandoned mining claim or forgotten homestead. "Are you sure?" I asked. "There is nothing down there." "Turn left," she repeated, her voice flat and emotionless. Every instinct I had was screaming at me not to turn. This was wrong. Everything about this situation was wrong. But I found myself slowing down, my hands turning the wheel almost against my will. The car left the paved highway and began bouncing along the rutted dirt road. Trees closed in on both sides, and within minutes, we were surrounded by dense forest. "How far?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Just ahead. You will see it." And I did see it. Through the trees, a structure came into view, a cabin, or what remained of one. The roof had collapsed, and the walls were blackened with fire damage. It had clearly been abandoned for decades. I stopped the car about 50 feet away, suddenly terrified. "This is where you want to go?" I asked, turning to look at her. She was staring at the ruined cabin with an expression I cannot adequately describe. Longing, maybe, or grief so profound it had become something else entirely. "I lived here," she said quietly. "Before." "Before what?" I asked. She did not answer. Instead, she reached for the door handle. "Thank you for bringing me home." I wanted to stop her, to tell her she could not possibly be planning to stay in that burned-out ruin, that I would drive her to the nearest town where she could get real help. But before I could say anything, she opened the door and stepped out. The moment her feet touched the ground, I heard it. A sound like wind chimes, or breaking glass, or something else I cannot properly describe. Musical and terrible at the same time. I turned in my seat to watch her walk toward the cabin, but she was not there. The passenger door was still open, cold air pouring in, but the woman had vanished. I mean, completely vanished. There were no footprints in the dirt, no disturbed vegetation, nothing to indicate she had ever been there at all. I sat frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then I saw something on the back seat, a photograph, old and faded, with scalloped edges like they used to make in the mid-20th century. I picked it up with shaking hands. The photograph showed a young woman standing in front of an intact version of the cabin I had just seen. She was wearing a long wool coat and had her hair styled in victory rolls. She was smiling. On the back of the photograph, written in faded ink, was a date, September 23rd, 1948, and a name, Eleanor Hartley. I threw the photograph back onto the seat as if it had burned me. I put the car in reverse and backed out of that clearing as fast as I could without crashing into a tree. Within minutes, I was back on the highway, driving toward Whitehorse at speeds that were probably unsafe. I did not stop, did not slow down, did not look in the rearview mirror because I was terrified of what I might see. When I reached Whitehorse 2 hours later, I went straight to the RCMP detachment. I told them everything that had happened, showed them the photograph, asked if they had any records of an Eleanor Hartley. The officer on duty was an older man who listened to my story with a patient expression that suggested he had heard similar things before. He took the photograph and examined it, then went to consult some records. When he came back, his expression had changed. Eleanor Hartley was reported missing in September of 1948, he said. She was traveling from Whitehorse to Skagway and never arrived. Her boyfriend reported her missing 3 days after she was supposed to arrive. They found her car abandoned on the Klondike Highway, but no sign of her. The case was never solved. "What about the cabin?" I asked. "The burned-out cabin off the highway." He nodded slowly. There was a cabin at that location. Records show it burned down in the winter of 1948. Eleanor Hartley owned that cabin with her boyfriend. After she disappeared, he was questioned but never charged. 2 years later, he died in a mining accident. "So she never made it to Skagway," I said quietly. "No, she never did." The officer kept the photograph for the case file, though he admitted there was not much they could do after so many years. He suggested that I might have experienced a shared hallucination or dream state brought on by fatigue and isolation, but he did not really believe that. I could tell by the way he looked at me, and by the way he told me to be careful driving alone on remote highways. I stayed with my friend in Whitehorse for a week, but I could not stop thinking about Eleanor. I did research at the local archives, finding old newspaper articles about her disappearance. She had been 24 years old, engaged to be married, working as a secretary in Whitehorse. She had been driving to Skagway to visit her sister when she vanished. The articles speculated about foul play, accidents, or simply getting lost in the wilderness. No one ever suggested that she might still be there, trapped somehow, trying to get home. I have driven that highway several times since then, but I have never seen her again. I pass the spot where I picked her up, and I see the dirt road that leads to the burned cabin, but I have never stopped. I'm too afraid of what might happen if I turn down that road again. Too afraid that I might see her standing there, waiting, still trying to make a journey that was interrupted 70 years ago. Other people have reported seeing her too. I found stories online, posts in forums, and local Facebook groups. A hitchhiker in vintage clothing on the Klondike Highway. A woman who gives directions to a burned-out cabin and then vanishes from locked cars. Some people think she's looking for her killer, that she is trying to show people where she died. Others think she is simply trying to complete her journey, to reach Skagway and her sister, to fulfill the promise she made before everything went wrong. I do not know what she wants. I do not know if she even knows anymore. All I know is that I picked up a ghost on a lonely highway, drove her to the place where she died, and watched her disappear into the ruins of her former life. And sometimes, late at night when I cannot sleep, I wonder if she's still there, still standing on that highway, with her thumb out, waiting for someone else to stop, waiting for someone else to drive her home to a place that no longer exists, except in her memory and in that faded photograph that now sits in an RCMP evidence locker. The Yukon is full of ghosts, people who came north, looking for gold or adventure or escape, and found something else instead. People who died alone in the wilderness, or in cabin fires, or in accidents on remote roads. People whose stories were never finished, whose journeys were never completed. Eleanor Hartley is just one of them, but she is the one I cannot forget. The one who sat in my passenger seat, cold as winter, silent as death, trying to find her way home. I was 26 years old when I took the winter caretaker job at Bonnet Lake Lodge, a remote outpost deep in the Yukon backcountry. The job sounded romantic to anyone who had never experienced northern isolation. 3 months in a log lodge overlooking a frozen lake, all alone except for daily radio check-ins. My friends in Whitehorse joked that I would come back either with a beard worthy of a Klondike miner or not at all. I laughed along. The pay was good. I craved the solitude and promised myself I would use the time to write and think. The supply van made the last delivery in mid-December, bringing canned goods, firewood, extra batteries, and the strong warnings of the departing driver. Check the generator every morning. Do not trust the ice until mid-January. The storm windows had to be kept free of snowdrifts. I nodded, made notes, waved goodbye, and listened as their engine faded. A sound I would not hear again until breakup in March. I spent the first 2 weeks reveling in the silence. Bonnet Lake lay encased in snow, wind smoothing its surface every night until the world looked new each morning. I followed animal tracks, mostly fox, sometimes wolf. The daylight lasted only a handful of hours, so I developed a rhythm. Rise late, split wood, check the radio, shovel paths, walk the perimeter, track temperatures, read, eat, sleep. I slept deeply. I had intense, vivid dreams every night, but I chalked it up to clean air and the absence of streetlights. My phone barely worked, and I preferred it that way. The first time something seemed off, I dismissed it. It was just after New Year's. I came down to the main kitchen, groggy and wrapped in a parka, to find the coffee pot not only full but steaming. I remembered putting fresh water in it the night before, but I distinctly did not make coffee. I'd finished the last cup well before midnight. My first thought was that I was slipping into autopilot, going through morning motions before fully waking up. People forget simple things, especially when their sleep schedules are irregular. I shrugged it off, poured a cup, and scribbled a note in my log. Memory glitch. But as the days grew shorter and the wind howled against the lodge, these harmless incidents multiplied. I would find my boots arranged neatly by the back door, though I had left them muddied and half frozen on their sides by the fire the evening before. A second batch of firewood, freshly split, appeared stacked against the wall. I only remembered splitting one armload. I wondered whether I was doing more work than I realized, losing track of actions as hours stretched and split, blurred by isolation and darkness. The radio check-ins were perfunctory, just a few words to confirm I was alive and well, surrounded by the emptiness of the Yukon. The nights changed by late January. My dreams took on a sinister edge. Conversations with voices I could not place. The sense of being watched, cold hands pressing down on my chest until I woke, gasping and shivering. I began to dread sleep, yet I was exhausted at all times. My energy had faded and my thoughts became scattered and hard to corral. I would read pages of my favorite books, realize I had absorbed nothing, and read them again, still with no memory. Then the handwriting started. It began as a single entry in my swollen caretaker's journal, a voice I did not recognize, sentences swirling on the page, looping in a script just slightly off from my own. Other Aiden takes over at night. He likes the cold. He does not like being alone. The next morning, I found that message, written in neat blue ink, 2 lines below where I had ended my previous log. I stared at it so long my eyes burned. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was an elaborate prank I had played on myself to stave off boredom. But every few days, a new message appeared. Sometimes they made no sense. Sometimes they described activities I did not recall. Stacked wood by north window, cleaned kitchen, turned porch lights on for visitors. There were no visitors. The lodge had a dozen bedrooms, but I used only 2, my own, and a room that adjoined the office, where I kept maps and my food stores. One afternoon, I found both doors standing open, boot prints on the floor. My boots, but not my gait. I would never have tracked mud so methodically between the two. The pantry door was propped wide, and the salt from the big tin had formed a perfect circle on the counter. I had watched dozens of horror movies in my life, and my nerves screamed now. This was the logic of dreams, or of obsession, not true forgetfulness. Every night, I set up reminders for myself. I left objects in odd places, took photos with my phone, scribbled notes. Every morning things were moved, sometimes put away with impossible precision, sometimes rearranged in odd patterns like a child playing house. I recorded myself sleeping on my phone's camera, battery and memory permitting. The first few nights yielded only the gentle sounds of breathing, dark and grainy video, but eventually I caught something. Myself wandering the halls at 3:14 a.m., eyes open but vacant, speaking softly. I could not make out the words, but I saw my hands moving, arranging boots, stacking firewood, opening doors, circling the kitchen in precise, hypnotic loops. By late February, I no longer trusted my own mind. I slept with the light on despite the way the shadows flickered and bounced. I set alarms for random times, waking myself until I felt fractured, running on an endless cycle of half-rest. The radio seemed to crackle more, with static sometimes filling the room even after I had signed off with bass. I thought I saw shapes moving in corners, reflected in the dark windows. The worst night was during a blizzard so fierce it felt like the world was ending. The wind screamed around the lodge. Snow piled up in the windows, obscuring everything. I locked myself in my room, barricading the door with a chair. I wedged my boots under the knob, knowing it was ridiculous but clinging to any illusion of safety. I lay awake listening to footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, heavy. I told myself it was just the sound of the log walls flexing, the wind howling, the snow settling off the eaves. At 3 a.m., the footsteps stopped in front of my door. A voice I did not recognize whispered, "Let me in. Let me in. I am so cold." I stared at the ceiling, paralyzed, convinced I was dreaming but unable to move. The doorknob twisted, once, twice, steady as breathing, then silence. At first light, I found my boots outside in the snow, as if someone had opened the door, stepped out, and left them there, neatly paired. Inside, the handwriting in my logbook had returned. "Other Aiden waited for you. Wanted you to let him in. You're safe in here. He is cold, but he waits." I could not eat that day. I huddled by the fire, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to radio base, but the line buzzed with static and fragments of words. My own voice, repeated and twisted, calling out for help that could not possibly be received or understood. In desperation, I finally called the lodge owner on the satellite phone, breaking protocol. I did not care if he thought I was losing it. He listened quietly to my garbled tale of sleepwalking, strange journal entries, and the sense of a double living inside the lodge. He did not laugh. Instead, he told me that 3 previous caretakers had reported similar experiences. Some quit midwinter, hiking out on snowshoes before their contract ended. Some stuck it out, but would not talk about those months afterward. "The darkness up there is old," he said. "There are things that get in your head. Just do your best to keep your mind busy and make it to March." I tried. I picked up crossword puzzles left behind by the previous caretaker. I read aloud to myself all day, filling the rooms with noise. I played the same album on repeat, old folk songs that felt warm and living. I left every light burning, went outside in the sun as much as possible, bundled up in every jacket I had. Still, the nights brought whispers, footsteps, the eerie sense of someone moving with me, copying my movements in the dark. On the final night of my contract, I was packing my bags when I found a stack of photographs tucked behind a loose board in the office wall. All featured caretakers in winter, some in park jackets I recognized, some older with faded edges. In every picture to the left of the caretaker, nearly invisible in the shadow, stood a second figure, blurred and indistinct. In one, a pair of eyes seemed to be staring directly into the camera from a dark window behind the subject. I dropped the photos and left them where they lay. When the supply van finally arrived in March, I barely recognized myself in the rearview mirror. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, older, I did not speak much on the ride out. The driver looked at me with sympathy, but did not pry. He knew something about that place. Back in Whitehorse, it took me weeks to sleep through the night. Every time I started to drift off, I would jerk awake, certain a cold hand would clamp over my mouth, or that my body would rise against my will and begin its midnight routines. I took the journal with the handwriting. Still, I cannot bear to open it. I keep it sealed in a locked drawer. Sometimes, when I'm tired, I find myself doodling circles in the margins of random papers, always in blue ink, always while I'm half asleep. I never returned to Bonnet Lake Lodge. When the new caretaker called for advice before his first winter, I told him to keep his mind busy, to avoid writing at night, and to never ever answer the voice at the door. There are things in the Yukon darkness, things that slip into the cracks of your mind, waiting for company. And some doors, once opened, are not so easily closed again. I was 28 years old when I took the wildlife biologist position in the Yukon. It was a dream job, really. Government-funded research, studying lynx populations in remote wilderness areas, with field work that took me deep into territories where few people ever ventured. I had always been comfortable in the backcountry. I grew up camping and hiking in British Columbia, earned my master's studying predator-prey dynamics, and spent summers working in national parks. The isolation did not frighten me. If anything, it was the draw. I wanted to be in places where nature operated without human interference, where I could observe animals in their truest form. My research station was a small cabin about 80 kilometers from the nearest road, accessible only by helicopter or, in winter, snowmobile. I spent weeks at a time out there, checking trail cameras, collecting scat samples, documenting den sites, and recording behavioral observations. The work was methodical and peaceful. Most days I saw no other humans, just the endless boreal forest, the tracks of animals in the snow, and the vast silence that only the far north can provide. It was early March when I made the discovery. I'd been following a set of lynx tracks that led me farther east than I usually traveled, into an area that was not part of my designated study zone. The terrain became rougher, the forest thicker. I was about to turn back when I saw it through the trees, a cabin. It was not marked on any of my maps, not listed in the territorial database of structures. It simply existed where no building should be. My first thought was that it might be an old trapper's cabin, abandoned decades ago and slowly being reclaimed by the forest. But as I approached, I realized it was occupied. Fresh snowmobile tracks led to a lean-to shelter beside the cabin. Smoke rose from a metal chimney pipe. Firewood was neatly stacked under a tarp. Someone was living here, and living here recently. I should have turned around immediately, should have marked the location and reported it when I returned to civilization. Unlisted structures in protected wilderness areas are always investigated. They could be illegal hunting camps, smuggling operations, or simply off-grid hermits who had failed to obtain proper permits. But curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to know who would choose to live this far from everything, and whether they might have seen any of the lynx I was tracking. The cabin door was unlocked. I knocked first, called out a greeting, waited. No response. I told myself I would just take a quick look, maybe leave a note introducing myself and asking the occupant to contact the research station. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The smell hit me first, chemical and wrong, like solvents mixed with something organic and rotting. The cabin interior was larger than it appeared from outside, a single open room with a loft accessible by a ladder. But it was what covered the walls that made my blood run cold. Photographs, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, taped and tacked to every available surface. All of them were of women, different ages, different settings. Some were clearly candid shots taken from a distance. Women shopping, women walking down streets, women getting into cars. Others were closer, more intimate. Women sleeping, women through windows, women who had no idea they were being photographed. And in every single photograph, the eyes were scratched out. Deep gouges in the photographic paper, as if someone had taken a knife or a pen and violently obliterated the eyes of every woman pictured. The effect was horrifying, transforming ordinary images into something nightmarish and threatening. My hands were shaking as I moved deeper into the cabin. A table held stacks of additional photographs, sorted into piles. On the wall above the table was a large map of the Yukon, with dozens of red pins stuck into it. Each pin had a small label. I leaned closer and felt my stomach drop. The labels were names and dates. Some I recognized from news reports. Women who had gone missing in the territory over the past decade. Not all of them, but enough. 5, maybe 6. Their names marked on this map like trophies or targets. I pulled out my camera and started photographing everything. The walls, the map, the table. I needed evidence, needed to document what I was seeing because I knew that even as I stood there, my rational brain was trying to reject it, trying to find innocent explanations that did not exist. This was not the home of an eccentric hermit. This was something much darker. That was when I heard it. The distant buzz of a snowmobile engine. Getting closer. Panic seized me. I was inside someone's home without permission, photographing their belongings. And those belongings suggested I was dealing with someone extremely dangerous. I looked around frantically for another exit, but there was only the front door and a small window above the sink that was too small to climb through. The snowmobile sound grew louder. I had maybe 2 minutes before whoever it was arrived. I ran to the door and scanned the area outside. My own snowmobile was parked about 50 meters away, clearly visible. There was no way to reach it without being seen. I made a split-second decision and dove under the loft into a narrow space behind stacked storage containers and old blankets. It was cramped and dark, but I could see a sliver of the cabin interior through a gap in the supplies. The snowmobile engine cut off. Footsteps crunched in the snow outside. The door opened and a man walked in. He was probably in his 50s, average height, wearing heavy winter gear. There was nothing remarkable about him. Nothing that would make you look twice if you passed him on a street, which somehow made everything worse. Monsters are supposed to look like monsters. This man looked like someone's uncle or high school teacher. He removed his gloves and parka, humming tunelessly to himself. He did not seem to notice anything amiss, did not react to the fact that the door had been unlocked and his photographs had been slightly disturbed by my examination. He moved to the stove and started preparing coffee. The ordinary domesticity of the action was surreal, given the horror show covering his walls. I tried to control my breathing, tried to remain absolutely silent in my hiding place. My phone was in my pocket, but there was no signal out here. Even if I could call for help, no one would arrive for hours, maybe days. I was completely alone with this man, trapped in his cabin, surrounded by evidence of his obsession and possibly his crimes. He poured his coffee and sat at the table, his back to my hiding spot. He pulled out a box and began sorting through more photographs. I could see them from where I crouched. New images, recently printed. And with growing horror, I recognized one of them. It was me, walking near my research station. The photograph had been taken from a distance, through trees, but it was unmistakably me in my field gear, carrying my pack. There were other photographs of me checking a trail camera, me entering my cabin, me snowshoeing across a frozen lake. He had been watching me, following me, documenting my movements, just like he had documented the movements of all those other women on his walls. He picked up a pen and leaned over one of the photographs. I watched in sick fascination as he carefully, methodically scratched out the eyes of the woman in the image. A woman I now recognized from a missing persons case 2 years ago, a hiker who had vanished near Dawson City and was never found. He added that photograph to the wall, tacking it beside others, and then turned his attention to the images of me. I knew I had to move, had to escape. If I waited until he discovered me, I would not survive. He was between me and the door, but he was distracted, focused on his photographs. I calculated the distance, maybe 10 feet to the door, another 50 meters to my snowmobile. If I moved fast, stayed low, I might make it. I waited until he turned to add another photograph to the wall, his back fully to my position. Then I moved. I shoved aside the blankets and ran for the door, not bothering with stealth anymore, just speed. I heard him shout behind me, heard the crash as his chair fell over, but I did not look back. I burst through the door and ran toward my snowmobile. The snow was deep and my legs felt like lead, each step an agonizing effort. Behind me, I could hear him coming, his boots pounding, his breath harsh and angry. He was shouting something, words I could not make out over the sound of my own gasping breaths and the blood pounding in my ears. I reached the snowmobile and threw myself onto it, my hands fumbling with the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I gunned the throttle, not waiting to warm it up, not caring about proper procedure. The machine lurched forward. He was close enough now that I could see his face, no longer ordinary and unremarkable, now twisted with rage, with desperation. He reached for the back of the snowmobile, his fingers brushing the cargo rack. But I was moving, gaining speed, pulling away. I looked back once and saw him standing in the snow, watching me go. He was not running anymore, just standing there, absolutely still, his arms at his sides. And then he smiled, a small, knowing smile that said he knew where my research station was, knew where I lived, knew I would have to come back. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station 20 kilometers away, told them everything, showed them the photographs on my camera. Within hours, the RCMP organized a raid on the cabin. They brought dogs, helicopters, a full tactical team. They were expecting a standoff, but when they arrived, the cabin was empty. The man was gone. So were most of the photographs. The walls had been stripped, the map removed, the table cleared. All that remained were a few scattered images, and some basic furniture. The RCMP searched the surrounding area but found no trace of him. His snowmobile was gone. The tracks led into the wilderness and then simply vanished in an area of broken terrain where tracking became impossible. The photographs I had taken were enough to open multiple investigations. Some of the women on his walls were identified as missing persons. Families were contacted. Task forces were assembled. But without the suspect himself, without the bulk of the evidence, the cases remained unsolved. They never found him. Never found any bodies. Never found the cabin he had presumably relocated to somewhere deeper in the wilderness. I left the Yukon 3 months later, took a position with Parks Canada in Ontario, as far from the territories as I could get while still doing the work I loved. But I could not shake the feeling of being watched. Could not forget that smile, that knowing expression that said he was not done, that he would find me again when he was ready. For the first year, I was hypervigilant, checked every room before entering, covered my windows at night, varied my routes to work, told myself I was being paranoid, that he had no reason to follow me across the country, that he had probably forgotten about me entirely and moved on to other targets. But then I would find something. A photograph taken of me from a distance, left on my car windshield. Security footage from my apartment building showing a figure in winter gear who did not match any resident. Subtle signs that someone had been in my apartment while I was at work. Nothing taken, just small rearrangements that might be coincidence but felt intentional. I contacted police each time, filed reports. But there was never enough evidence to act on. Never any proof that the incidents were connected to the man from the cabin. I began to wonder if I was imagining things. If the trauma of that day had broken something in me that made me see threats where none existed. But late at night, when I lie awake listening to every sound in my apartment building, I know the truth. He is out there. He is patient. He is careful. And someday, when I have finally let my guard down, when I have finally convinced myself that I am safe, he will come back to finish whatever he started. Because men like that do not give up. They do not forget. They collect and they wait, and they always come back for the ones who got away. I was 24 years old when 3 of us decided to canoe the Yukon River for a week-long camping trip. My buddies Jake and Marcus had been planning it for months, and I jumped at the chance to join them. We were all experienced paddlers, comfortable in the backcountry, and excited about the adventure. The plan was simple. Put in at Carmack's, paddle downstream for about 150 kilometers, and take out at a predetermined spot where Jake's brother would meet us with a truck. 7 days on the water, camping on sandbars and riverbanks, fishing for our dinners, and disconnecting from civilization. We loaded our canoes with gear and provisions in late June, when the days were long and the weather was mild. The first 2 days went exactly as planned. The river was wide and calm, the current doing most of the work while we enjoyed the scenery. We saw moose, bald eagles, and more waterfowl than we could count. At night, we set up camp on gravel bars, cooked fish we had caught, and sat around the fire telling stories until the sun finally dipped below the horizon around midnight. On the 3rd day, we decided to camp at a site that looked perfect. A wide, flat area on the east bank with a natural windbreak of willows and a fire ring that showed previous campers had used the spot. What we did not notice, or perhaps what we chose to ignore, were the small cairns stacked near the tree line. Piles of stones, deliberately arranged, marking something. We should have recognized them as indigenous grave markers or spiritual sites. Should have understood that some places are meant to be respected, not used. But we were young and thoughtless, and we set up our tents without a second thought. That evening, as we prepared dinner, Jake mentioned that the area felt strange. He could not articulate what he meant, just that something about the place made him uncomfortable. Marcus laughed it off, joking about wendigos and other northern legends, but I felt it too. An oppressive quality to the air, as if we were being watched. The usual sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the rustling of small animals, seemed muted and distant. We built a fire as the sky darkened. That was when we heard it for the first time. A whistling sound, low and melodic, coming from somewhere upstream along the riverbank. It was not quite music and not quite speech, but something in between. The sound moved, circling our camp at a distance, never getting closer but never fading away. We tried to convince ourselves it was wind through the trees or some bird we did not recognize. But the night was calm, and the whistling had a deliberate quality that no natural phenomenon could explain. None of us slept well that night. I lay in my tent listening to that sound rising and falling, sometimes seeming to come from multiple directions at once. In my dreams, I was drowning. The water was dark and cold, pulling me down while pale hands reached up from below, grasping at my clothes and hair. I woke gasping, tangled in my sleeping bag, heart pounding. Jake and Marcus later admitted they had experienced identical nightmares, drowning in dark water, hands pulling them under. In the morning, we discovered our canoe had been moved. We had pulled all 3 boats well up onto the shore the previous evening, securing them above the high water mark. But one canoe, mine, was now sitting 50 feet inland, balanced impossibly on top of a flat boulder. There was no way the river could have moved it there. The water level had not risen overnight. And even if it had, water does not lift a heavy canoe and carefully place it on top of a rock. We stood staring at the canoe, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. Marcus suggested it was a prank, that locals had come during the night and moved it as a joke. But there were no footprints around the boulder except our own. No drag marks, no signs of how the canoe had gotten there. And the boulder itself was too tall for 3 men to easily lift a canoe onto it without leaving some trace of their presence. Jake wanted to leave immediately, pack up and paddle on to the next campsite. But Marcus and I talked him into staying one more night. We were being irrational, we told him. There had to be an explanation. We had paid for permits for this specific itinerary, and changing plans would complicate our pickup. We convinced ourselves that moving forward would be cowardly, an overreaction to some weird but ultimately harmless events. That second night at the site was when things became truly terrifying. We stayed close to the fire after dark, no one willing to venture more than a few feet from the flames. The whistling started earlier this time, just after sunset, closer too, moving through the willows that surrounded our camp on 3 sides. And as darkness deepened, we began to see movement, figures, pale and indistinct, moving between the trees, never fully visible, just glimpses caught at the edge of our vision. When we turned to look directly, there was nothing there, but the sense of being surrounded grew stronger with each passing minute. The fire, which should have provided comfort, seemed instead to cast shadows that moved wrong, that bent in directions that defied the light source. Then the water changed. The Yukon River, which had been flowing steadily past our campsite all day, suddenly became still. Perfectly, unnaturally still, as if someone had frozen it in place. The current simply stopped. We stood at the edge and stared at water that looked like dark glass, reflecting the stars above but not moving, not flowing, not behaving like water should behave. Marcus was the first to see the hands. He shouted and pointed, and we all saw them. Pale, elongated hands reaching up from beneath the surface of the motionless water. 5, 10, maybe 20 hands breaking through that glassy surface and slowly curling, as if beckoning, as if inviting us to come closer, to wade in, to join whatever waited below. We ran, all 3 of us, simultaneously and without discussion. We grabbed our most essential gear, sleeping bags, phones, the satellite beacon, and we ran inland, away from the river, crashing through the willows and into the forest beyond. Behind us, the whistling had become a chorus, multiple voices rising and falling in what might have been song or might have been laughter. We did not stop running until we could no longer hear the river. We huddled together in a small clearing, backs against each other, scanning the darkness around us. Hours passed, maybe all night. Time felt distorted and strange. When dawn finally came, we were 5 kilometers from our campsite, exhausted and disoriented. We activated the emergency beacon. Within 3 hours, a helicopter arrived. The pilot asked what had happened, why we had abandoned our camp and gear. We told him we had gotten lost, that we had panicked and run. He accepted the explanation without question, probably assuming we were inexperienced tourists who had underestimated the wilderness. He flew us back to Carmack's, and we arranged for someone to retrieve our gear and canoes from the campsite. A week later, when our equipment was returned to us, I noticed something wrong with my canoe. There were handprints on the hull, dozens of them. Pale marks, as if made by hands, coated in some kind of chalky substance. They covered the entire underside of the boat, overlapping and pressed so hard into the fiberglass that I could feel the impressions when I ran my hand over them. They would not wash off. I tried everything: soap, solvents, even light sanding. The marks remained, permanent reminders of whatever had touched my canoe that night. Jake sold his gear and swore off backcountry camping. Marcus still goes out occasionally, but never in the Yukon, and never anywhere near indigenous burial sites. I kept paddling, but I researched first. I learned about the river spirits, the stories that indigenous peoples had passed down for generations about places that should not be disturbed, about waters that held the dead, about sounds and signs that meant you were not welcome. An elder from the First Nation in the area eventually told me what we had encountered. The site we had camped at was a traditional burial ground, used for water burials centuries ago. The cairns we had ignored were markers warning people to stay away. The river there holds spirits, she said, spirits that do not want to be disturbed by the living. When you camp on their ground, they will try to take you, pull you into the water to join them. The whistling is how they call to each other, alerting the others that the living have come. She performed a cleansing ceremony for us, burning sage and offering prayers to the spirits we had offended. She told us we were lucky to have escaped, that others had not been so fortunate. There were stories of paddlers who camped at that site and were found drowned the next morning, their bodies pulled from the calm water with no explanation for how they had ended up there. Stories of people who vanished entirely, leaving only their gear behind. Stories that stretched back generations, long before Europeans came to the territory. I still have that canoe. I could not bring myself to get rid of it, even though looking at those handprints makes my skin crawl. They serve as a reminder that the wilderness is not just scenery. It is not just a backdrop for our adventures. It is inhabited, filled with history and spirits and forces we do not understand. The indigenous peoples knew this. They marked the places that should be avoided, created protocols for how to travel respectfully through the land. We ignored those warnings because we thought we knew better, thought our experience and our modern equipment made us immune to old superstitions. But we learned the hard way that some places remember. Some places hold grudges. Some places will reach out and try to pull you down into the dark if you are foolish enough to trespass on ground that was never meant for you. The Yukon River still flows past that campsite, still looks peaceful and inviting to paddlers who do not know its history. And on certain nights, when the conditions are right, you can still hear the whistling coming from the willows, still see the pale figures moving between the trees, still watch as the water becomes unnaturally still and those reaching hands emerge, beckoning the living to come closer, to wade in, to join the dead below. I have paddled that section of river only once since that trip. It was daylight, and I did not stop. I kept my eyes forward and my paddle moving, giving that campsite a wide berth. But as I passed, I swear I heard it, faint but unmistakable. The whistling, rising from the willows carried on the wind. A sound that meant warning and threat and memory all at once. And I paddled faster, putting as much distance as I could between myself and that cursed place, knowing that some debts are never fully paid. Some places never forgive. And some nights, when I close my eyes, I'm back in that camp, watching pale hands reach up from impossible still water, waiting for me to make the mistake of coming close enough to grab. I was 27 years old and working as a bartender at the downtown hotel in Dawson City when I witnessed something that changed my understanding of reality. It was early September, the tail end of tourist season, and the bar was moderately busy with a mix of locals and the last few visitors before winter shut the town down. I had been living in Dawson for 3 years at that point, drawn by the same things that attract most people to the far north: the chance to escape, to reinvent yourself, to live somewhere that feels removed from the rest of the world. It was a Thursday night, around 11:30. I was wiping down the bar when one of the regulars, an old miner named Tom, grabbed my arm and pointed toward the window. "You seeing that?" he asked, his voice urgent. I looked outside and saw what appeared to be lights in the sky, not the northern lights, which I had seen countless times. These were different. Distinct orange orbs, perfectly circular, hovering silently above the town. Within minutes, everyone in the bar had noticed. We all moved to the windows and stepped outside onto the street. The lights were impossible to ignore. There were 5 of them, arranged in a loose formation, completely motionless, about 300 meters above the buildings. They were bright enough to cast a faint orange glow on the street below, but did not flicker or pulse like normal lights. They simply existed, suspended in the night sky with no visible means of support. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. So did a dozen other people. We stood there watching for 15 minutes, maybe longer. The lights did not move, did not make any sound, did not behave like aircraft or drones or anything we could identify. Someone called the airport to ask if they had any aircraft in the area. The answer was no. Someone else tried to reach the RCMP, but the local detachment was closed for the night, staffed only by an emergency line that told us to report non-emergencies during business hours. Then, without warning, the lights simply vanished, not gradually, not fading or moving away. They were there 1 second and gone the next, as if someone had flipped a switch. The street fell back into normal darkness, illuminated only by the streetlights and the glow from the bar windows. We all stood there in stunned silence, trying to process what we had just witnessed. The conversation in the bar afterward was intense. Everyone had theories: military testing, drones, reflections from mining equipment, ball lightning. But none of the explanations felt adequate. Military aircraft would have made noise. Drones could not hover perfectly still for that long. There was no mining equipment nearby that could create that effect. Ball lightning does not form perfect geometric shapes and hover motionless. I went home around 2 in the morning, my mind racing. I uploaded the photos I had taken to my computer, examining them closely. The orbs were clearly visible in the images, ruling out any possibility that we had experienced some kind of mass hallucination. Whatever we had seen, it was physically present and capable of being photographed. I posted a few images to social media with a caption asking if anyone else had seen the lights. Within an hour, I had responses from people across Dawson City confirming they had witnessed the same thing. I went to bed exhausted but too wired to sleep properly. I remember lying in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, replaying the experience in my mind. Eventually, I drifted off sometime after 4 in the morning. The next thing I remember, I was waking up to my alarm at 11 a.m. But something was wrong. My alarm was set for 7:30, and it had definitely gone off. I distinctly remembered hitting the snooze button twice before finally getting up. Except I had not gotten up. I had somehow lost 3.5 hours. I checked my phone. Multiple alarms had gone off and been dismissed, but I had no memory of dismissing them. No memory of the time between 4 a.m. and 11 a.m. I sat up in bed, and that was when I noticed my arm. On the inside of my left forearm, about 4 inches below my elbow, was a mark I had never seen before. It looked like a burn, except the pattern was too precise to be accidental. Geometric shapes, triangles within circles connected by straight lines, raised and red against my skin. It did not hurt. It did not itch. It simply existed where nothing had been the night before. I took photos of the mark and tried to convince myself there was a rational explanation. Maybe I had burned myself on something at the bar and not noticed. Maybe I had scratched myself in my sleep, and the pattern was coincidental. But the marks were too clean, too deliberate, and they did not fade. Over the following days, I expected the redness to diminish, the raised tissue to flatten. Instead, the marks became permanent. The redness faded to a pale silvery color, but the geometric pattern remained, visible under certain lighting conditions impossible to explain away. I went to the health center in Dawson and showed the marks to a nurse practitioner. She examined them, took photos for the medical record, and admitted she had no idea what could cause that kind of scarring. Not a burn, not a rash, not an allergic reaction. The pattern was too precise, and there was no sign of infection or trauma. She suggested I might have developed them during a period of sleepwalking or some kind of dissociative episode. She recommended I see a specialist in Whitehorse if the marks did not fade within a month. But the marks were only part of the problem. The missing time disturbed me more. I tried to reconstruct what had happened between 4 a.m. and 11 a.m. But there was nothing. No dreams I could recall. No sense of the passage of time. Just a blank space where 7 hours should have been. I checked my phone's activity log. It showed that I had been moving around during those hours. The step counter had recorded over 3,000 steps, but I had no memory of where I had gone or what I had done. I started asking around town, trying to find other people who had witnessed the lights. What I discovered was unsettling. Out of the dozens of people who had seen the phenomenon, at least 8 reported experiencing missing time that night, gaps ranging from 2 hours to nearly 6, and 3 others besides me had developed unexplained marks on their bodies. One man had a perfect circle burned into his shoulder blade. A woman had a series of dots arranged in a triangular pattern on her neck. Another had linear scars on his calf that appeared overnight. We formed an informal group, meeting at the bar to compare experiences and try to make sense of what had happened. Someone suggested we report it to the Canadian government, to whatever department handles unexplained phenomena. But who do you even call for something like that? We contacted Transport Canada, who referred us to the military, who referred us to the RCMP, who took our statements, but made it clear they had no jurisdiction over lights in the sky. One member of our group found a researcher from the University of Alaska who studied unexplained aerial phenomena. He drove up to Dawson to interview us, examined our photographs, and documented our stories. He told us that similar events had been reported throughout the Yukon and Alaska for decades. Lights in the sky followed by missing time and physical marks. He had files full of cases that matched our experience almost exactly. But he had no answers. No explanation for what caused the phenomena or what happened during the missing time. The researcher asked if any of us had experienced recurring dreams or intrusive thoughts since the incident. I had. Almost every night since seeing the lights, I dreamed about being in a bright room with no visible walls or ceiling. Just endless white light and the sense of being examined, of being measured and cataloged. I would wake from these dreams with my heart pounding, convinced that something had happened to me that my conscious mind refused to acknowledge. Other members of the group reported similar dreams, being in bright spaces, feeling observed, a sense of helplessness and paralysis. One woman said she dreamed repeatedly about being on an examination table while shadowy figures moved around her. A man described dreams of floating, of being pulled upward into the sky against his will. The consistency of these experiences was disturbing. Either we were all experiencing similar trauma-induced nightmares, or something had actually happened to us during those missing hours. The researchers suggested we undergo hypnosis regression therapy, a controversial technique used to recover suppressed memories. Some of us agreed. I was one of them. I met with a therapist in Whitehorse who specialized in trauma and memory recovery. Over 3 sessions, she guided me into a relaxed state and asked me to recall the night of the lights. What emerged during those sessions was fragmentary and dreamlike. Impossible to verify, but deeply disturbing. I remembered waking in the night, although not in my bed. I was somewhere else, somewhere bright. I could not move, could not speak. There were presences around me, but I could not see them clearly. They were examining me, doing something to my arm. I felt pressure, but no pain. I heard sounds that might have been voices, but might have been something else entirely. And then nothing. Blank. The next clear memory was my alarm going off at 11 a.m. The therapist cautioned me that recovered memories under hypnosis are not reliable. They might be genuine recollections, or they might be confabulations, false memories created by my subconscious mind to explain the missing time. There was no way to know for certain, but the experience felt real, more real than any dream I had ever had, and it matched the experiences described by others in our group who had undergone similar therapy. The Canadian government never provided an explanation for the lights. No official investigation was launched. Our photographs and testimonies were filed away somewhere, added to whatever database they maintain for unexplained phenomena. The researcher from Alaska published a paper about our case, but it received little attention outside of fringe communities interested in UFOs and paranormal events. Life in Dawson eventually returned to normal. The tourist season ended. Winter came. The group that had formed to discuss our shared experience gradually disbanded. Some people moved away, unsettled by what had happened, and wanting to distance themselves from the memories. Others rationalized the experience, convincing themselves it was nothing more than unusual lights and sleep disturbances brought on by stress. But I could not forget. The marks on my arm would not let me. Every time I looked at them, I was reminded that something happened that night. Something beyond my understanding or control. I started researching similar cases, spending my free time reading reports from around the world of people who had encountered unexplained lights and experienced missing time. The patterns were consistent, the stories remarkably similar, and in almost every case, the experiencers were left with more questions than answers. I joined an online support group of people who had similar experiences. Hundreds of us spread across the world, connected by our shared trauma and confusion. Some believed they had encountered extraterrestrial beings. Others thought it was government experiments. Some had no theory at all, just the knowledge that something inexplicable had happened to them, and that the world was stranger and more frightening than they had previously imagined. I still live in Dawson City. I still work at the downtown hotel, though I have considered leaving more times than I can count. The town feels different now. When I look at the night sky, I'm not filled with wonder anymore. I'm filled with dread, with the knowledge that there are things up there we do not understand, things that can reach down and touch us and alter us in ways we cannot explain or defend against. The marks on my arm have never faded. They are a permanent reminder of that September night when orange lights hovered silently over Dawson City, and something took hours from my life that I will never get back. I do not know what happened during that missing time. I'm not sure I want to know, but the not knowing is its own kind of torture. Living with the certainty that something was done to me, that I was powerless to stop it, that it could happen again at any time. Sometimes I see other people in town with marks they cannot explain. A scar that appeared overnight. A pattern burned into skin with no clear source. And I wonder if they were there too. If they shared the experience but cannot remember it. If we are all walking around with pieces of our lives missing, stolen by something we can never hope to understand or confront. The lights have not returned to Dawson City. Not since that night in September, but I know they are out there. I know they are watching, and I know that when they decide to come back, there will be nothing any of us can do to stop them. I was 30 years old when I decided to spend a night at the Caribou Hotel in Carcross, specifically requesting room 7. I had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the Yukon knows about the Caribou Hotel's reputation as one of the most haunted buildings in the territory. But I had always been skeptical of ghost stories, dismissing them as folklore and overactive imaginations. I worked as a freelance writer, and I thought staying in the supposedly haunted room would make for a good article. A first-person account debunking the myths, explaining away the strange experiences with logic and reason. The hotel itself is a beautiful historic building, constructed in 1898 during the Klondike Gold Rush. It sits at the edge of Carcross, overlooking Bennett Lake, a structure that has survived fires, renovations, and over a century of harsh Yukon winters. The owner checked me in with a knowing smile when I asked specifically for room 7. "You are here for the ghost," he said. It was not a question. I nodded, explaining that I was writing an article. He told me that room 7 had a history. Guests reported extreme cold even when the heat was running. Objects moving on their own. The sense of a presence in the room, particularly near the window that overlooked the lake. And most commonly, the appearance of a woman in Victorian-era clothing, standing at the foot of the bed or sitting in the room's antique chair, weeping silently. "Has anyone ever been hurt?" I asked, thinking about liability and wondering why the hotel continued to rent the room if it was genuinely dangerous. "No," the owner said. "She is not violent, just sad. Very, very sad. Most people who see her say she seems lost, looking for something or someone she cannot find." I thanked him for the information and carried my bag up to the second floor. Room 7 was at the end of the hallway, isolated from the other guest rooms. The key was an old-fashioned brass type, heavy in my hand. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was exactly what you would expect from a historic hotel. Antique furniture, including a brass bed frame, a wooden dresser with an oval mirror, and a high-back chair positioned near the window. The wallpaper was period-appropriate, faded roses on a cream background. A small radiator sat beneath the window, and I could hear it clanking as hot water circulated through the old pipes. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old wood. I set up my laptop and notepad, documenting my first impressions. The room felt normal, slightly old-fashioned and a bit cold, but nothing unusual. I took photographs, measured the temperature with a digital thermometer I had brought, and settled in for what I expected to be an uneventful night. The first few hours passed without incident. I worked on editing an article, checked my email, and around 9 in the evening went downstairs to have dinner at the hotel's small restaurant. When I returned to room 7 around 10:30, I noticed the temperature had dropped significantly. The thermometer, which had read 18 degrees Celsius when I left, now showed 12 degrees. The radiator was still functioning. I could hear the water moving through it and feel warmth when I placed my hand near the metal, but the room itself was freezing. I checked the window to see if it had somehow come open, but it was sealed tight. I checked for drafts around the door and found none. The cold seemed to be emanating from the center of the room itself, as if the air had simply decided to lower its temperature in defiance of the heating system. I made notes on my laptop, trying to think of rational explanations. Perhaps the insulation in this particular room was poor. Perhaps cold air was somehow entering through the walls or ceiling. At 11:30, I prepared for bed. I changed into sweats and a heavy shirt, piling extra blankets from the closet onto the bed. The cold had become intense enough that I could see my breath. I took another temperature reading, 9 degrees Celsius. The room had lost another 3 degrees in less than an hour, despite the radiator working overtime. I could hear it groaning with the effort, steam occasionally hissing from the valve. I climbed into bed and tried to read, but the cold made it difficult to concentrate. My hands were numb. My nose felt like ice. I set an alarm on my phone for periodic checks throughout the night, wanting to document if the temperature continued to drop or if it stabilized. Then I turned off the light and lay in the darkness, listening to the old building settle around me. That was when I heard the music. Faint but unmistakable. Old-timey music, the kind you would hear on a gramophone. A woman's voice singing in a style popular in the early 1900s. The sound seemed to be coming from somewhere in the room, but when I turned on the light and looked around, there was no source. No radio, no speakers, no device that could be producing the sound. Yet the music continued rising and falling in volume, sometimes loud enough to hear the words, sometimes fading to barely audible whispers. I recorded the sound on my phone, wanting evidence. The recording picked up the music clearly, ruling out the possibility that I was imagining it. I searched the room more thoroughly, checking behind furniture, examining the walls for hidden speakers or vents that might be carrying sound from another part of the building. I found nothing. The music was simply there, existing without a source, playing songs that had not been popular for over a century. Around 1 in the morning, the music stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, heavier than the sound had been. I lay in bed, every sense on high alert, waiting for what would happen next. The cold had intensified to the point where I was shivering despite 3 blankets and my winter clothing. The thermometer now read 6 degrees Celsius. The radiator was still pumping out heat, but it made no difference. The cold was not natural. It could not be fought with conventional warmth. Then I saw her. At first, just a shadow near the window, a darker shape against the darkness of the room. But as my eyes adjusted, as I stared without blinking, the shadow resolved into something more solid. A woman. She was standing with her back to me, looking out the window toward the lake. She wore a long dress with a high collar and full sleeves, her hair pinned up in a style from the turn of the 20th century. She was completely still, so still that she might have been a statue, except that I could see her breathing. The slight rise and fall of her shoulders, the movement of her head as she gazed at something I could not see. I wanted to speak, wanted to ask who she was, what she wanted, but my voice would not work. My throat was frozen, whether from fear or from the cold, I could not tell. I simply lay there, watching her, my heart hammering so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. She remained at the window for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then slowly she turned. I saw her face in profile first, young, perhaps in her 20s, pale skin, dark hair, features that might have been beautiful except for the overwhelming sadness that distorted them. She was crying, tears streaming down her face, though she made no sound. She turned further, facing the bed, facing me, and I saw her eyes. Empty. Not physically empty, but emotionally hollow, as if everything that had made her human had been scraped away, leaving only grief. She looked at me and I felt her sorrow. It was overwhelming, crushing, a weight that pressed down on my chest and made it difficult to breathe. She was not angry. She was not threatening. She was simply the saddest thing I had ever encountered, lost and alone and searching for something she would never find. She moved toward the bed, not walking exactly. She seemed to glide, her feet not touching the floor. She stopped at the foot of the brass bed frame and reached out one hand, as if asking for help. I wanted to recoil, to pull the blankets over my head and hide like a child, but I could not move. I was paralyzed, whether by fear or by some influence she exerted, I did not know. Her mouth moved, forming words, but no sound came out. She was trying to tell me something, trying to communicate across the gulf between her world and mine, but I could not understand, could not hear, could not help. And the frustration of that, the knowledge that she was reaching out and I could not respond, made her grief even more profound. Then she was gone. Between one blink and the next, she simply ceased to exist. The room was empty again. The oppressive cold remained, but the presence had vanished. I lay in bed for a long time, shaking, trying to process what I had just experienced. My phone was on the nightstand. I grabbed it and checked the time, 2:17 in the morning. I had been watching her for nearly 40 minutes. I turned on every light in the room and sat in the chair by the window, the same chair where Geese had reported seeing her sitting. I could not bring myself to get back in that bed. Could not close my eyes. I sat there until dawn, occasionally checking the thermometer and watching the temperature slowly rise as the sun came up. By 6 in the morning, the room had returned to a normal temperature. The cold had simply evaporated with the darkness. I did not check out immediately. Instead, I went downstairs and asked the owner if he knew the history of the woman who haunted room 7. He told me the story. In 1911, a young woman named Sarah had stayed at the hotel while waiting for her fiancé to return from the goldfields. He had promised to come back for her, to marry her, and take her south to start a new life. She waited for 3 weeks, staying in room 7, watching the lake from the window, waiting for his boat to arrive. He never came. Eventually, the hotel owner at the time told her that her fiancé had died in a mining accident 2 months earlier. He had never intended to return because he was already dead. Sarah locked herself in room 7 and refused to eat, refused to speak. She sat at the window, staring at the lake, and died of grief and starvation within a week. They found her in that chair, still looking out at the water, still waiting for someone who would never arrive. The owner showed me photographs from the hotel's archives, images from the early 1900s, and there she was. Sarah, the woman I had seen, the same face, the same hair, the same period dress. She was not a figment of my imagination or a creation of suggestible psychology. She was real, or at least, she had been real, and some part of her remained, trapped in that room, still waiting after more than a century. I left the Caribou Hotel that morning and drove back to Whitehorse. I never wrote the debunking article I had planned. How could I? I had experienced something that defied rational explanation. I had seen a ghost, not a shadow or a trick of light, an actual apparition, a woman who had died over 100 years ago and who still lingered in the place where her heart had broken. I have returned to the Caribou Hotel twice since that night, though I have never stayed in room 7 again. I spoke with the owner, with longtime staff members, with other guests who had experienced Sarah's presence. Everyone described the same woman, the same period dress, the same overwhelming sadness, the same sense of someone reaching out across an impossible distance, trying to communicate something vital but unable to bridge the gap. Some of the hotel staff tried to help her. They brought in indigenous elders to perform cleansing ceremonies. They consulted with mediums and paranormal investigators. Nothing changed. Sarah remained bound to that room by grief so profound it had survived death itself, waiting for a man who would never return, looking out at a lake that had long since given up whatever secrets it might have held. I think about her often, wonder if she knows she is dead, wonder if she understands that the man she loved is gone and has been gone for over a century. Wonder if anything could ever bring her peace, or if she is condemned to wait forever, trapped in a moment of hope that can never be fulfilled, doomed to repeat her vigil until the hotel itself crumbles and there is no window left from which to watch. The experience changed me. I no longer dismiss ghost stories out of hand. I no longer assume that everything can be explained by science and logic, because I have seen proof that consciousness can persist beyond death. That emotion, particularly grief, can be so powerful it leaves an imprint on the world that refuses to fade. Sarah is not just a ghost. She is evidence that love and loss can transcend the boundaries of mortality, and that sometimes the saddest stories never truly end. I was 29 years old when I took the job as an archivist at the Dawson City Museum. It was a dream position for someone with my background in history and library science. The museum housed extensive collections related to the Klondike Gold Rush, including thousands of documents, photographs, personal letters, and artifacts from that wild period in Yukon history. My job was to organize, preserve, and digitize these materials, making them accessible to researchers and the public. One of my first major projects involved cataloging materials related to the Mad Trapper of Rat River, one of the most infamous manhunts in Canadian history. For those unfamiliar with the case, in the winter of 1931 to 1932, a man known only as Albert Johnson engaged in a weeks-long pursuit through the frozen wilderness of the Northern Territories. He had shot a Mountie, evaded capture through incredible wilderness survival skills, and ultimately died in a shootout after leading police on a chase that covered over 240 kilometers. His identity was never confirmed. No one knew who he really was or where he had come from. The mystery of the Mad Trapper had fascinated researchers and amateur sleuths for nearly a century. The museum's collection included RCMP reports, newspaper clippings, witness statements, and even some personal effects that had been recovered from Johnson's body. I spent weeks going through the materials, creating detailed inventories and preservation plans. It was fascinating work, bringing me closer to a piece of history that still captured public imagination. About 3 weeks into the project, a man came into the museum asking to see the Mad Trapper materials. This was not unusual. We regularly had researchers, true crime enthusiasts, and history buffs requesting access to various collections. I brought him to the reading room, showed him the cataloging system, and explained the procedures for handling archival materials. He thanked me and spent about 2 hours examining documents and taking notes. He returned the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. For 2 solid weeks, he came in every day during my shift, always requesting the same materials, always spending hours poring over the documents. His questions became increasingly specific. He wanted to know about the contents of Johnson's cabin, about items that had been recovered but not photographed, about witness statements from trappers who had seen Johnson in the months before the manhunt began. I started to feel uncomfortable. There was an intensity to his interest that went beyond academic curiosity or casual fascination. He would lean very close to the documents, muttering to himself, occasionally making sounds of frustration or excitement. When I asked what he was researching, he gave vague answers about family history and setting the record straight. He never elaborated despite my polite attempts to engage him in conversation. Then his behavior began to escalate. He started asking me personal questions. Where did I live? Did I walk to work or drive? Was I married? Did I live alone? I deflected these questions, maintaining professional boundaries, but he persisted. He would wait outside the museum when my shift ended, appearing on the street corner as I locked up. He never approached me directly, just stood there watching until I walked away. I reported his behavior to my supervisor, who agreed it was concerning but noted that he had not actually done anything threatening. He was a member of the public accessing public archives. As long as he followed the rules, we could not ban him from the museum. My supervisor did speak with him about appropriate boundaries, and for a few days, his behavior seemed to improve. He stopped asking personal questions, stopped waiting outside. I thought perhaps the warning had worked, but then I saw him outside my apartment building. I lived on 4th Avenue, several blocks from the museum, in a small apartment complex that was not visible from any public location near my workplace. There was no reason he should know where I lived unless he had followed me home. When I saw him standing across the street smoking a cigarette and staring at my building, my blood ran cold. I called the RCMP and filed a report. They sent an officer to speak with him, and he claimed he was just taking a walk, that it was a coincidence he had ended up on my street. The officer advised me to document any further contact and to call immediately if he approached me or entered my property. But without evidence of a direct threat, there was little they could do. The man did not come to the museum for several days after the police visit. I allowed myself to hope that the intervention had scared him off. Then one evening, as I was working late on a digitization project, I found something left on my desk. A piece of old trapping equipment, specifically a jaw trap like the ones used in the 1930s. It was rusted and clearly antique, and placed on top of it was a note written in crude handwriting. He hid it. You will find it. We can share. I immediately took the note and the trap to my supervisor, who called the RCMP. The museum had security cameras in the public areas, but not in the staff offices. The cameras showed the man entering the museum during public hours, but did not capture him accessing the staff area. He must have slipped back during a transition between tour groups when the front desk was unattended. When questioned by police, he claimed he had left the trap as a gift to thank me for my help with his research. The note, he said, referred to his belief that Albert Johnson had hidden gold or valuable items somewhere in the wilderness, items that had never been recovered. He thought that clues to the location might be hidden in the archival documents I was cataloging. He wanted me to help him find those clues so we could split whatever treasure might still be out there. The police explained that while his behavior was inappropriate and concerning, he had not made any explicit threats. They could issue a trespass warning, preventing him from entering the museum, but they could not arrest him or obtain a restraining order without evidence of stalking or harassment that met the legal threshold. The officer was sympathetic, but clear about the limitations of what they could do. The museum banned him from the premises. We installed additional security cameras and implemented a buddy system where no staff member worked alone. I changed my routine, varying my routes to and from work, parking in different locations, never walking alone after dark. For several weeks, I saw no sign of him. I began to relax, thinking the police intervention and museum ban had finally convinced him to move on. Then the letters started arriving. Not at the museum or my apartment, but forwarded through the museum's general mail. Someone was sending letters addressed to me care of the Dawson City Museum. The return addresses were fake, the postage marks from various small communities throughout the Yukon. The content of the letters was disturbing, rambling thoughts about the mad trapper, about injustice and hidden truths, about how they did not want the real story to come out, about how he and I were the only ones who could uncover what had really happened, about how we were meant to work together. One letter was particularly chilling. It described in detail what I had been wearing the previous Tuesday, what time I had left my apartment, which coffee shop I had stopped at on my way to work. He was still watching me, still following me, still documenting my movements even though he could no longer approach me at the museum. The police upgraded their response. The letters constituted evidence of ongoing harassment and stalking. They obtained a restraining order and intensified their efforts to locate him. But he had disappeared. His listed address was a rented room that he had vacated weeks earlier. He had no vehicle registered in his name, no employment that they could identify. He had simply vanished into the vast Yukon wilderness, and despite their best efforts, the RCMP could not find him. I lived in constant fear. Every sound outside my apartment made me jump. Every stranger on the street was a potential threat. I installed deadbolts and a security system. I carried pepper spray. I took a self-defense class, but the anxiety was crushing. I could not sleep, could not eat, could not focus on my work. The job I had loved had become a source of terror. 3 months after the letters started, I received one final communication. It arrived in my museum mailbox, hand-delivered rather than mailed. Someone had bypassed building security and placed an envelope directly in the internal mail system. Inside was a suicide note. He claimed he was going into the wilderness to find what the mad trapper had hidden, that if he could not share the discovery with me, he would rather die in the attempt, that he was sorry for frightening me, but that I had to understand how important this was, how the truth had to be revealed. The note ended with specific coordinates in the wilderness north of Dawson City, and a request that if his body was found, his research notes should be given to me. The RCMP took the note seriously. They organized a search of the area around the coordinates he had provided, bringing in helicopters and experienced wilderness trackers. They found his camp, a tent, some supplies, research materials related to the mad trapper case, but no body, no sign of what had happened to him. Just an abandoned camp and more questions than answers. The official investigation concluded that he had likely died in the wilderness, either from exposure, an accident, or deliberately. The search was called off after 2 weeks, the assumption being that his body would eventually be found by hunters or hikers, if it was found at all. The vast Yukon wilderness holds many secrets and many bodies that are never recovered. I left Dawson City 2 months later. I could not stay. Every time I walked down the street, I expected to see him. Every time I accessed the Mad Trapper archives, I thought about his obsession and his belief that I held some key to unlocking a mystery that had consumed him. I took a position with Library and Archives Canada in Ottawa, as far from the territories as I could get while staying in my field. But I could not escape entirely. Several months after I moved, I received a package. No return address. Postmarked from Dawson City. Inside was a journal, clearly the research notes he had mentioned in his suicide note. Page after page of obsessive notations, theories about the Mad Trapper's true identity, maps marked with possible treasure locations, and photographs. Photographs of me, dozens of them, taken over months without my knowledge. Me walking to work, me at the coffee shop, me through the window of my apartment. The visual evidence of how thoroughly he had been stalking me. And on the last page of the journal, a final message. I will find it. And when I do, I will come back for you. We will share this. It is our destiny. I turned the journal over to the RCMP in Ottawa, who forwarded it to their colleagues in the Yukon. The investigation was reopened. They searched for him again but found nothing. He remains missing, legally presumed dead, but never confirmed. His identity was eventually established through fingerprint records. A man with a history of obsessive behavior and paranoid delusions, previously institutionalized in British Columbia, with no actual connection to the Mad Trapper case or to anyone involved in it. His obsession was entirely fabricated, built on conspiracy theories and mental illness, but knowing he was mentally ill does not make me feel safer, because the journal proved he was deeply invested in his delusion, and delusions do not simply evaporate. If he is alive, he is out there somewhere, still believing that I am the key to his imaginary treasure, still thinking that we are connected by some cosmic purpose, still waiting for the right moment to return and finish what he started. I no longer work with archival materials. I could not maintain the passion for the work after it had been tainted by fear. I took a position in library administration, working with budgets and management rather than historical documents. It is safer, more anonymous, less likely to attract the attention of people looking for hidden meanings and secret truths. But sometimes I wonder about him. Wonder if he really did die in the wilderness, or if he simply disappeared to wait and watch from a distance. Wonder if he abandoned his obsession with the Mad Trapper, or if it consumed him entirely. Wonder if the package I received was truly his last communication, or if another letter will arrive someday, postmarked from some remote location, reminding me that in his mind, we are forever connected, that our story is not finished, that he is still out there, waiting in the darkness, believing that destiny will bring us back together to uncover secrets that exist only in his fractured imagination.